we're very excited to have a conversation with you. Like many of the other conversations, we'll start with a little bit of the informal stuff and how we know each other, and then we'll get into the depth of it, as it were. But just tell me where you're calling us from today, because we're doing all of these over the internet, so that's interesting to know something about that, I think. Yes.
Sure. Well, I'm talking to you from the middle of Somerset, right in the countryside. The internet connection isn't that great. Hopefully the quality of the audio will be fine.
Yeah, we're hearing you absolutely fine. Yeah, no, brilliant.
That's where I'm from, calling from today, and it's nice to see you.
And I guess I've known you for a long time. I think we were establishing that contact happened through through a group called the New Directions in the Study of Alcohol group, which was well, I don't know. Tell me what you remember of those times.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was rather an important time for me. I mean, I got invited along to one of the conferences of the New Directions group, and I'd heard about quite a few of the people who were involved at that time. This was probably I can't remember if it was the late 90s or the early 2000s, but it was around the turn of the century. And I kind of read books by Nick Heather and John Davis and assorted other people, and I was very interested in what they'd been writing about. And suddenly I came to this conference to talk about, I was invited to talk about 12-step recovery, but from a kind of psychological point of view. It was a sort of analysis of 12-step recovery from the point of view of the type of therapy that I'm trained in, which is called Cognitive Analytic Therapy. And I got a very respectful and interested audience. And I kind of started to get to meet people. I mean, obviously I was a newcomer. I remember Trevor McCarthy very vividly. And either at the first or the second, I saw you across the room and I thought, that looks like an interesting guy. And we struck up a conversation. So, and I also think I heard you talking, presenting, discussing different things. So what I found at New Directions was it was a supportive friendship group, really. I mean, it was very unlike a kind of academic conference, because people actually formed proper relationships there, I think, and it was a collection. It was a real motley crew, actually. I mean, I think that the New Directions group by that time, because of course it had been founded in the 70s for a very singular purpose, by that time it had become very diverse and quite welcoming of different viewpoints, and it was described by Doug Cameron as a safe place to express, kind of heretical views about addiction. And I began to enjoy those conferences very much, and used to see you at them regularly, and they were a kind of important, kind of what Trevor would call my favourite gig of the year, and that was it was hugely important, because it kind of broadened not just my reading. I was actually meeting the people who were thinking and talking and working in different ways. So that was an important event, and that's the origin of our friendship, I guess.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing that you says resonates with me, given what we're going to talk about for most of the interview. Of course, in its own way, it was a peer support group for some people that weren't fitting comfortably in other academic spaces, which was kind of quite interesting in itself. So it had that little bit of element of outside a peer support group, which obviously resonates at one level with recovery groups. But what I do remember as well was that you were one of the first voices I heard in that environment actually talk about recovery. And like you say, it was a group that was born out of really talking very much about unusual concepts of harm reduction and controlled drinking, which wasn't always the sphere at that point in time. We're a little bit cautious of where people were talking about abstinence, and perhaps had formed in its early stages some unusual understandings about abstinence and recovery being synonymous with only a very limited perspective. And what I really remember from those days was that you were one of the first people that really helped just broaden some of those conversations in that space, such that over the forthcoming period, many more people were able to just add that understanding to lots of other things that were being said. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think people became more respectful of each other's positions. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember meeting Nick Heather, who I knew already by that time, at the Project Match conference in London, and he was in kind of despair because, the 12-step intervention had been just as successful as the other two, and in some ways more successful. And he was saying, well, perhaps we should just send everyone to AA. Now, of course, that there was much more complexity and nuance, as there always is with Nick, but there was this sort of eye-opening set of meetings and research studies that came out that kind of actually strangely pulled people together in the New Directions group, because people were genuinely open-minded. It was, there wasn't a group that was entrenched in a particular stance. I mean, before, the New Directions group had been specifically there to kind of resist what they saw as the kind of medicalized disease model of addiction, which was so dominant in the 50s and 60s. People often talk about that as a new thing, that somehow this is a new insight. But actually, throughout the 20th century, most medical addiction specialists would have characterized addiction as a disease without even thinking about it. And what the psychologists in the 70s did was say, well, maybe this is, some of the insights we have about human learned behavior can be applied to uncontrolled drinking. Now, that started off as something I want to talk about, which is the immediate polarization and enmity, how threatening it was to take one position or another, that this was a matter that people had very, very strong feelings about. The people who believed that abstinence was absolutely necessary for recovery for anybody that had an addiction felt very angry towards people who suggested that you could, some people were able to regain control or regain moderation, to go beyond the harmful consequences of their addictive drinking and return to something else. That whole idea was thought of as, perverse. And conversely, the people who were, kind of supporting the psychological models were thinking of the abstinence crew as outdated, paternalistic, authoritarian, closed-minded.
Quite partisan, really, in its own way.
Very partisan, and that doesn't, I hate all of that. I mean, as soon as anything happens in our field, the people spring up to take one side or another, and it's something that's perhaps connected to what alcohol and drugs do in society, that they, in some ways, resolve a lot of that. When you get a little bit intoxicated with alcohol, somehow the person opposite you seems very friendly, and all those kind of those sort of enmities dissolve. Yes. And somehow in recovery they all return. So
there's more commonality in some states than others. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was Gregory Bateson that first pointed that out in the 50s, where he said that the alcoholic, when drunk, has an epistemology that makes sense, but as soon as they get sober, it doesn't work at all. So in some ways, recovery is about discovering a way of living that actually works for you.
And I want to get into all of this conversation is about unpicking so much more of that, which is your understanding of all of these things that you've learnt over all of the years.